So the car we're here to drive today is a very early example of a Mk5 Ford Escort. This is a pretty poverty spec 1.4 LX. This is registered in December 1990 and they came out in about September 1990. For me, the Mk5 Escort is a classic case of automotive complacency, but to some extent for understandable reasons. Pretty much from 1982 onwards, the Mark III and Mark IV Escort were the best seller in the UK. So naturally, when Ford came to replace that model, they just wanted to make it a little bit better. So they extended the wheelbase by 5 inches. They've got torsion bar rear suspension, which is a bit more of a compact setup for a bigger boot. The trouble was with that approach though is that Ford kind of misjudged how good the competition was by then. Rover had brought out the R8 in 1989, the Renault 19, Peugeot 309. There was a lot of very formidable competition, all on the market doing a lot better for a lot of a lower price. The Mark V sort of came out quite an average car in comparison to other cars on the market. But I was keen to take a drive in this car to see if they really were as bad as the road testers remembered back in the day. So you've got to hand it to Ford. They knew how to sell a car. Throughout the late 70s, they started to dominate the sales charts, outselling anything from BL and the likes. They took advantage of the fact that it had this vast dealer network and excellent marketing. And that really pushed cars that perhaps didn't necessarily deserve to sell as well as they did only on merit. They basically just did everything right for the market. They did the bare essentials and sold it at a price that was right. And when the Mark V came out, it did exactly that. It just tried to move the game on just a little bit. But where Ford really misjudged it is that they really promoted heavily the fact that they'd spent £1 billion developing this new replacement car. They made a really big play of the fact that it was to come out in a 3-door, 5-door, an estate, a cabriolet, and of course the Orion Saloon, complete with rear wiper. There was still an awful lot of penny pinching going on. Like, it may have been an all-new body shell, you know, revised suspension and all this kind of stuff, but it still inherited the old CVH engines. The 1.4 actually came out with the Mark IV facelift of '86, but the CVH obviously has its origins in the Mark III of 1980, so certainly by 1990. From a powertrain perspective, it was outclassed. Road testers of the day bemoaned the 1.4 CVH as being harsh. You had to work it really hard to extrapolate as much of that 73 brake horsepower as possible. And because you had to work it hard, you then got to explore the limits of the slightly spongy 5-speed manual gearbox. Because you were revving it quite hard, and the CVH engine doesn't generally like to rev, road testers back in the day were saying they weren't getting much more than 29 to the gallon, which is hardly what the average fleet man is looking for from their car. The Mark V Escort also got it in the neck for its ride and handling. I think it was described as soggy, which is pretty similar to the weather today. So it had a softer ride than the Mark IV, but it wasn't always good. At low speeds like now, it's actually pretty good. But over slightly higher speeds, sort of deeper potholes and things, you'd be met with a crash and a bang and a thud, which was very indicative of the Mark IV that it replaced. Steering was the other thing that got the criticism. It's non-power assisted, so lacks any feel whatsoever. It's also 4.6 turns lock to lock, so you'll be doing a lot of twirling at parking speeds. It just lacks any sort of feel or weight to it really. But the real faux pas was when Ford did the European launch of the Mark V. The 1.4 models didn't come with a front anti-roll bar, which the 1.6 models did. It just meant that the handling was diabolical really. It rolled and it pitched, and it scrubbed its power off with these sort of skinny tyres. Ford took that criticism on board quite seriously, and they halted production and then fitted anti-roll bars to the 1.4 models, but it was still only okay. Like a Rover R8 or a VW Golf was always a better car. A Fiat Tipo was a better handling car and more spacious. A Renault 19 was better. All of these competitors were generally offering a better driving experience and were just as practical, just as stylish, and in some cases a bit cheaper than the Mark V Escort. This was £9,500 when it came on sale in the UK, whereas the equivalent Renault 19 was about £8,700. Once Ford had understood that they'd kind of missed the mark a bit, they went back to the drawing board pretty quickly. Richard Parry Jones, who sadly passed away earlier in 2021, was credited with turning around the Mark V, and the hastily arranged facelift of 1992 really improved things. Much better suspension geometry, the introduction of the new Zetec engines by then, and of course the reintroduction of the XR3i. There was a further facelift in 1995 which sort of changed the styling of it, and by then I think the Escort was as good as it was ever going to get. Plus it had the halo models, the XR3i, and it had the RS2000. So the question really, I suppose, is this as bad as it was made out to be? Well, objectively speaking, yes, it probably is. But Ford won't have been the only manufacturer to have misjudged the market, or indeed rushed a car out perhaps a couple of years earlier than it should have done. It's got some strengths, don't get me wrong, it's not a terrible car. You know, the interior is actually quite nice. The ergonomics are very well thought through. There was a lot made of these sort of injection moulded seats, but for all the so-called high-tech construction nature, they really are quite bad. And they're not that comfortable. They don't offer huge amounts of support. All that twirling. Oh, there we go. Oh, it's like steering a ship. And the 1.4 CVH engine, in this example at least, is it's actually quite smooth. It's purring along quite nicely. It's no ball of fire, but again, for the average buyer of the day, they wouldn't have expected much. I think a lot of what this all boils down to, the Mk5 didn't manage expectations well enough. For all the much heralded development money spent on it, the car that came out wasn't considered to be worth all those development dollars. £1 billion, that's a lot of money, and they really didn't get their money's worth. The car was 5% better than the car it replaced, when really it needed to be 20 or 30% better. But don't mistake it for being a bad car. It represents Ford at a point in its life when it perhaps did get a bit carried away. It took the dominance that it had in the 1980s for granted, and it completely overlooked the creeping confidence of its European, Japanese counterparts. But like I say, from the low point of the Mk5 ultimately spawned the Ford Focus in 1998. Ford would no longer take for granted this market and knew they had to do better. I'm a sucker for an underdog, always have been, and to some extent maybe that is also the appeal of the Mk5. Don't look away from the Mk5 Escort. It's not as bad as everyone made out. It was a low point for Ford for sure, but without it you wouldn't have got the Mark I Ford Focus, and I think we should be grateful for that, if nothing else.